Kumusta po mga kabayan? Happy New Year po sa inyong lahat. In this video, we will talk in English and Tagalog. Our video content for today is about Rt-Pcr requirement to the Philippines. We will answer most of the commonly asked questions like number 1, when should I take my Rt-Pcr test? Kailan po ba ako dapat magpa-Rt-Pcr test? Number 2, how about if you have multiple transit or connecting flights? When should you take your Rt-Pcr test? Kung marami po kayong connecting, marami po ang nangangamba at hindi alam kung kailan ba dapat talaga sila magpapa-Rt-Pcr. Number 3, usually 72 hours is the requirement of most countries and most transit countries. However, for countries like Singapore, their requirement is stricter. So, we shall talk about this one too. Karamihan po ng bansa 72 hours lamang ang hinihingi, katulad ng Pilipinas. Subalit may mga bansa po na mas mahigpit kasi kahit transit lang kayo at isa dito ay ang bansang Singapore. So kung may transit po kayo ng Singapore o ng iba pang bansa na mas mahigpit pa sa Pilipinas, panoorin po ang video nito hanggang sa uli dahil pag-uusapan po natin ito. Number 4, if you are on a direct flight, then it is easy. But most of us will be flying with at least one stopover or transit. Now, the flight duration will be very long. The question is, will my Rt-Pcr test expire when I arrive in the Philippines? And if that happens, will it still be accepted by BOQ or the Bureau of Quarantine? Number 5, so the IATF says get an Rt-Pcr test, but when you get your result, it says PCR and not Rt-Pcr. Is this still accepted? Is this the same? We will discuss that too. Pareho lang ba ang Rt-Pcr at Rt-Pcr? Tatanggapin pa kaya ito pagdating natin ng Pilipinas? Number 6, will I be swabbed in the nose or mouth? Is saliva test accepted? Saan nga ba yung swab? Sa ilong ba? Sa bibig? Pwede ba yung saliva or yung laway? Number 7, are children also required to take this Rt-Pcr test? Pag-uusapan din po natin ang requirement sa mga bata. Number 8, do you need a printed copy of the test result? Kailangan nyo po ba ng printed copy ng resulta? Number 9, what if the result is only via SMS or text message? Pwede po ba yan kung SMS text lang ang ipapakita? Number 10, I cannot upload my test result into the One Health Pass. Ano po ang gagawin natin kung hindi ma-upload ang Rt-Pcr test result sa One Health Pass? Before that, please consider to subscribe to this channel, hit that like and notification bell to help our channel reach more people traveling to the Philippines. Salamat po sa mga walang sawang pagpindot ng like button at pagbibigay ng mga komento at pagtitiwala sa pagsagot namin sa inyong mga katanungan. Now, all these questions will be answered if we read or listen to the IATF announcement. So let's start by doing that and then we will dig deep into the details and explanation.
Kailangan nilang magpakita ng negatibong Rt-Pcr test taken within 72 hours prior to departure from country of origin.
Okay, so the IATF announcement is concise but your flight itinerary and situation is diverse. Malinaw po yung sinasabi ng IATF kaya lang yung sitwasyon ng kada pasahero iba-iba. So let's explain each lines very carefully. In the IATF resolution, we will summarize that there are two main rules. Rule number 1, it must be Rt-Pcr. It means antigen test is not accepted. When you go to the testing facility, you have to be very specific. Tell them you need to go on an international flight and you need an Rt-Pcr test. Hindi po tatanggapin yung antigen test. Kapag pumunta po kayo sa testing facility, sabihin po sa kanila na may international flight po kayo at kailangan nyo po ng Rt-Pcr. And of course, the result must be negative. If the result is positive, of course, you should not travel po. Magpagaling muna po tayo kung may sintomas. Rule number 2, your Rt-Pcr test must be taken within 72 hours before your flight or prior to your departure. What does this really mean? It means from the time the sample is taken, or this is the time when you were swabbed, to the time of your actual departure should be 72 hours or less. For example, your flight departure is January 12 at 9:10 p.m. Simply count 3 days before your flight date. So we have January 9, 10, and 11. 3 days po yan. Starting January 9 at 9:10 p.m. onwards, you can take an Rt-Pcr test. Of course, you have to consider flight delays and also the speed at which the test result will be released. Sa Tagalog, ang inyong RT-PCR test ay dapat kunin sa loob ng 72 hours bago ang inyong paglipad o bago ang inyong departure. Ano po ba talaga yung ibig sabihin nito? Simula po sa oras na kukuhanin ang sample o yung oras na maswab talaga kayo, matusok yung ilong nyo o yung bibig ninyo, masusulat po yan sa inyong Rt-PCR certificate. Hanggang sa oras po ng inyong aktual na pag-alis, yung mismong departure po na nakasulat sa ticket nyo, dapat po yan ang total nyan ay 72 hours or less. Halimbawa, ang inyong flight departure ay January 12 ng 9:10 ng gabi. Magbilang ng 3 araw bago ang petsa ng inyong paglipad. So, January 9, 10, and 11. 3 araw po yan. Simula January 9 ng 9:10 ng gabi o pataas, maaari na pong magpa-RT-PCR. So, tanong po, kung January 9 ng umaga, magiging valid po ba yung RT-PCR? Hindi po. January 9 ng 9:10 ng gabi po pataas. Yun lang po yung magiging valid. So, syempre, kailangan nyo rin pong isaalang-alang ang posibleng flight delay at kung kailan lalabas ang resulta. Basta ang mahalaga po, makukuha nyo po ito bago kayo pupunta ng airport. Now, most travelers miss this important information out. The Rt-PCR test must be taken prior to departure from country of origin. I have to emphasize, from country of origin. So if you have multiple transit, it does not matter. If you are traveling to the Philippines, your reference will always be the country of origin. Karamihan sa mga umuuwi ay nakakaligtaan ang isang mahalagang impormasyong ito. Ang Rt-PCR test ay dapat kunin bago umalis sa bansang pinanggalingan. Bigyan din po natin mula sa bansa na pinanggalingan. Kahit marami kayong transit, ang basihan po natin ay palaging ang bansang pinagmulan. Now, we are clear about international transit and your country of departure. It means what it means if you have a domestic flight. Do not consider those domestic flights. Again, IATF says prior to departure from the country of origin. So your reference will always be the last city where you will exit or depart your country. So cross out your domestic flight in your computation. Malinaw na po tayo kanina tungkol sa international transit at alin ba talaga yung basihan sa prior to departure from country of origin. Ibig sabihin, kung mayroon kayong mga domestic flight, huwag pong isama ang domestic flight sa computation natin. Ulitin po natin, ang sabi ng IATF, bago umalis sa bansang pinanggalingan. Kaya ang ating basihan ay palaging ang huling lungsod o syudad kung saan tayo lalabas o aalis ng bansang pinanggalingan. Example, Jeddah to Riyadh. Ang basihan natin ng oras ay yung flight natin sa Riyadh at hindi yung flight sa Jeddah. Bakit po? Kasi sa Riyadh po tayo lalabas ng bansang Saudi Arabia, hindi po sa Jeddah. Okay. For those with transit to other countries which are stricter than the Philippines, keep watching because we will discuss those special cases later. But before that, let's answer the frequently asked questions. We will base it from the IATF resolution. First, we know already that we need an Rt-PCR test, but when we get our result, some of us will only see that it will say PCR. Is this different from Rt-PCR? The quick answer, it is not. So, coronavirus PCR test is always an Rt-PCR test. The question is, are the check-in counter staff aware of that? There were passengers who were denied boarding because the check-in counter staff does not know this. So, just in case you are questioned, unfortunately, you have to explain it to them if they don't know. Tulad po ng mga galing sa UAE, sa Europa, usually nakalagay po dyan PCR lang. So kung ma-question po kayo bakit PCR lang ang nakalagay, dahil ang nasa check-in counter po, hindi naman po yan medical professional. So hindi po sila aware minsan. So in that case, kailangan po natin silang paliwanagan. So to do that, we will try to explain to you what is PCR and why is a coronavirus PCR test always an Rt-PCR test. Now, disclaimer, we are not medical professionals. What we will share is based on readings from online materials from the US CDC, WHO, and from other prominent medical university websites. Of course, you can always make your own research. So, let's start by explaining what is a PCR test. Ano ba ang PCR test? In a PCR test, you need a sample which contains genetic materials, specifically DNA. Trained professionals will use a PCR machine to process this sample. After processing, the virus DNA will multiply. So if you have the virus, it will be detected with high accuracy. Sa Tagalog, ang PCR testing po kailangan ng sample na naglalaman ng mga genetic na material, particular ang DNA. Ang mga trained na professional ay gagamit ng PCR machine para iproseso ang sample na ito. Pagkatapos ng pagproseso, ang DNA ng virus ay dadami. Kaya kung mayroon kayong virus, ito ay matutukoy ng may mataas na accuracy. Now, the problem with the coronavirus, the genetic makeup of the COVID-19 is not DNA, it's RNA. The problem is that the PCR machine can only process DNA. So, simply put, they have to convert this RNA to DNA. And to do that, they have to use the so-called reverse transcription. That's why it is called Rt-Pcr. There is no other way. A coronavirus PCR test must always be an Rt-Pcr test. RNA to DNA conversion first. Okay, sa Tagalog po. Ang problema kasi sa coronavirus, ang genetic material na bumubuo ng COVID-19 ay hindi DNA. Ito ay tinatawag na RNA. Ang problema, DNA lang ang kayang iproseso ng PCR machine. Hindi niya kaya yung RNA ng COVID. Kaya sa madaling salita, kailangan nilang i-convert ang RNA sa DNA. At para magawa ito, kailangan nilang gamitin ang tinatawag na reverse transcription. Kaya naging Rt-Pcr. Wala pong ibang paraan. Ang PCR test ng coronavirus ay palaging Rt-Pcr. RNA to DNA conversion muna po palagi. Tip, if you are still in doubt, then if the test name and manufacturer are written in your test certificate, you can also verify it in Google. Example, in this certificate, it only said PCR, but fortunately, it specified the test name and manufacturer. It says here SARS-CoV-2 real fast assay. I checked in Google and it confirmed that this is a reverse transcription method, so Rt-Pcr po talaga ito. Now, will you be swabbed in the nose or mouth? Answer, it depends on the testing facility. Each test manufacturer will have an instruction. If it says deep into your nasopharyngeal, so medyo nakakaiyak po talaga yan kasi medyo deep. It can also be on both nose and mouth. Sana nga lang yung unang tusok sa bibig muna bago sa ilong at hindi tusok ilong tapos itutusok sa bibig. But of course, trained professionals po yan, so don't worry. Next question, is saliva test accepted? So, in Japan, actually also in the Philippines, there are testing facilities that can take the saliva as the sample instead of the swab. So, yes, this is accepted as long as the test method to be used is Rt-Pcr. What do we mean by this? Saliva Rt-Pcr test is accepted, but saliva antigen test is not accepted. Now, how about the children traveling with you? 3 years old and below are exempted sa pre-departure Rt-Pcr requirement, but note that they will be swabbed during your hotel quarantine. Okay, 4 years old and above are required. And as IATF mentioned, their testing and quarantine protocol when they arrive will follow the parents or the guardians. So kung day 5 ang swab, iswab din po sila sa day 5. Kung lalabas na po kayo, then lalabas din po sila kasama kayo kahit po sila ay hindi bakunado. Okay po? Now, printed copy of the test result. We highly recommend that you have this because most airlines will look for a printed copy. What if the result is only via SMS or text? Pwede bang gamitin yung SMS or text lang? No, hindi po. It should have an official certificate po. Now, what if you cannot upload the test result into the One Health Pass? We have a video about this. Please click this link above. Now, before we discuss the special consideration for those with transit flights, sa may mga transit po, please listen. I-review po natin para malaman kung kailan tayo magpapa-PCR test. At this point, you know already our main reference is always the departure city and the time from the country of origin. Now, if you have a domestic flight, example, San Francisco to Los Angeles, our reference is the departure date and time at Los Angeles. Another example, if you have a domestic flight, Jeddah to Riyadh, then ang reference po natin ay ang flight date and time sa Riyadh. Now, if you have a transit flight, most of them will not require you for an Rt-Pcr test. Example, Tokyo, Seoul, or Incheon, Doha in Qatar, or in Dubai if you're transiting only, they don't have special requirement from you. Ang hahanapin lang po nila kung ano yung requirement sa inyong final destination, which is 72 hours Rt-Pcr test. Okay? So, ang basihan lang natin palagi ay yung tinuro na namin sa inyo kanina, yung city of departure from country of origin. Count 3 days before that. Example dito, January 12, 9:10 p.m. ang flight. Then starting January 9 at 9:10 p.m. you can take your Rt-Pcr. So usually ginagawa lang po ito kung matagal yung paglabas ng resulta. In instances that results will come out late, then you have this option. But the most recommended is do it the next day. So if the result will be released in just 24 hours or 1 day, then do it 1 day after. Now, you can also take your Rt-Pcr 1 day before, but you have to make sure that you will get the result before you go to the airport because you may still have to print the copy. Now, let's go to your other transit countries. First, Singapore. It is one of the strictest. Transit passengers through Singapore, you need a COVID test 2 days before your flight to Singapore. So, pasok ba dito yung 72 hours Rt-Pcr test natin to the Philippines? Now, our reference here is the departure time before Singapore, which is in this example, our first departure. Here they said days. So, hindi po oras yung basihan sa Singapore. So, the time does not matter here in Singapore. So, example from January 12 to 11, that's 1 day. Then, January 11 to 10, that's another day. So, total of 2 days. It means take your test on January 10. If you take the test on January 9, invalid po yan. You will not be allowed to board your flight to Singapore. Then, mas mahigpit pa po yung Kuwait sa transit. If you have a transit in Kuwait, your reference is the departure flight to Kuwait. Yung flight papuntang Kuwait po. So, from that day and time, count 24 hours. Then, another 24 hours. So, total po yan, 48 hours. Yan po ang requirement sa Kuwait. Okay, if you're transiting in Malaysia, the Rt-Pcr test requirement is 72 hours. So, pasok po dyan yung Rt-Pcr requirement ng Pilipinas. Kaya wala na po kayong additional na gagawin. Sundin lang yun na pag-usapan na natin kanina. If transiting in Thailand, your Rt-Pcr test to the Philippines is also okay. But note that you need to make sure you have a travel health insurance which will cover Thailand. Okay, now transit in Bahrain, your Rt-Pcr to Philippines will cover that Rt-Pcr requirement in Bahrain. So, pasok na po yan. Also, transit in Muscat and transit in Abu Dhabi, your Rt-Pcr to Philippines will cover their transit requirements. So, pasok po yung Rt-Pcr natin dyan. Now, last thing about transit. Transit in Taiwan is still not allowed po. Okay? Now, let's go to the last question. If you have multiple flights and then your total flight duration is very long, will your Rt-Pcr expire when you arrive in the Philippines? Will BOQ or Bureau of Quarantine still accept your Rt-Pcr? Tatanggapin pa rin po ba to ng BOQ? Yung answer po is BOQ must accept it. Ang BOQ or Bureau of Quarantine, kailangan po nila itong tanggapin. Why? Because the IATF resolution clearly specified the test is to be taken 72 hours prior to departure from the country of origin. Hindi po sinabi doon na arrival. Malinaw pong sinabi departure sa bansang pinagmulan, hindi po arrival sa Pilipinas. So, basta nakaalis na po kayo at in-accept sa check-in ang inyong Rt-Pcr, dapat pong i-accept din yan ng BOQ. Okay? But why do some passengers claim that they were questioned by BOQ saying their Rt-Pcr is expired upon arrival? Again, you may have to explain it to them po. The IATF resolution specified Rt-Pcr is to be taken 72 hours prior to departure from country of origin. So, yun po ang purpose ng ating vlog. Para po kayo ay informed, para kung questionin po kayo, pero alam naman po ninyo na tama ang inyong ginawa at na-comply nyo ang requirement, then you can defend yourself. Maipagtatanggol po ninyo ang inyong sarili kung sakali po kayong questionin. So, dyan po nagtatapos ang ating mahabang pag-uusap at sana naman po ito ay nakatulong sa inyo. Again, manigong bagong taon po sa inyong lahat. Pagpalain po ang inyong biyahe, ang inyong pamilya sa papasok na bagong taon. God bless you and see you on the next update.
Kailangan nilang magpakita ng negatibong Rt-Pcr test taken within 72 hours prior to departure from country of origin.